Hello, and welcome back to Directly Current. It's been a while. If you're a returning listener, we took August off. We are back after the Labor Day holiday. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'm your host, Max Patton, and we've got some exciting news to share with you here from EVs for All America. We've partnered with a nonprofit called Veloz, who has a very slick campaign called Electric for All at electricforall.org. They've got this ad campaign voiced by Nick Offerman. Yep, that's right, Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec, narrating some of the benefits of EVs, like lower cost of ownership with no oil changes, not having to pay for gas, the lack of range anxiety with modern models, and all that good stuff. We recommend that you share it with your friends and family as well. But to talk about it today, I'm going to have Josh Boone, who's the executive director from Veloz. Before we get into the conversation, I'm going to give some heads up here. Just a reminder that the federal EV tax credit is accelerated in terms of its ending, thanks to that one big bad bill passed this summer. September 30th is the deadline, not to actually acquire an EV, or not technically to have one in your driveway, but to have a contract for one. That's a small wrinkle that's really important based off some IRS guidance released last week. Super in the weeds, we'll link that guidance as well. But if you happen to be in the market for an EV, or you know someone who is, I think it's super helpful knowledge because it can buy you a little bit more time. But please do act on that quickly because, again, that's ending September 30th. So by then, you do need to have a contract in ink and a deposit put down. Savings are big, of course, with the federal tax credit, but it's not exclusively there. There's a huge local and state component to it. That's part of what Electric for All is doing. But to hear more about it, let's hear from Josh himself. Thanks so much for coming on to Directly Current. First of all, can you give listeners who may not know a heads up on what Veloz does for EVs and for communicating that to drivers of EVs and non-EVs?
Yeah, thanks for having me today. So means fast in Spanish, and it really drives to the heart of our mission, which is we are trying to help electrify the transportation sector across the country as fast as possible. So we are a California-based 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we are a membership group of 40 plus different members from all walks of the EV ecosystem working to electrify transportation.
Nice. And just some history lessons here. Obviously, there's been a lot of tumult with the way the environmental regulation of transportation's worked recently and with everything that's gone on there. But just in the last few years, there's been a surge in EV adoption and progress. So what have been some of the major campaigns or major messaging points for Veloz to the public when we're talking about things like the tax credit, cost of ownership? Like, what does that look like over the last few years?
Yeah, I think it's worth going all the way back to 2010 and thinking about what the EV market looked like in 2010. So
Yeah.
July 2010, we were expecting kind of a rebirth of the EV market, at least in California. We were expecting the first Nissan Leafs and Chevrolet Volts. And you might recall that those vehicles had, at least on the BEV side, anywhere between 60 and 85 miles of range. So it was a different world then. And now, 15 plus years later, what we are seeing is more than 100 makes and models of EVs are available. We've got growing charging infrastructure, everything from the ability to charge at home to charging at your workplace to charging at the beach, and a really increasingly robust fast charging network. And the market has really shifted. And I think the thing that we really want to convey today is that there's a real opportunity to take advantage of short-term savings on EVs and to take advantage of the federal tax credit before they expire on September 30th. So there's both like the short-term savings of getting into an EV in terms of taking advantage of the credits, both the federal, state, and local credits, as well as the long-term savings of EVs, which they're just cheaper to drive, fewer parts to maintain. And so when you look at the total cost of ownership, EVs make sense no matter what.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I know you guys have compiled some data. I've seen data from several policy folks showing that like across models, take something like a Chevy Equinox EV versus its ICE analog or a Tesla Model Y. In that vehicle class particularly, even without the tax credit, you're looking at not just cost competitiveness, but savings in the neighborhood of at least $2,000 over an ownership period of 5 years. And that's just with normal driving, not any kind of extreme driving.
Right.
That's significant, but also like you said, we have to headline this up front. September 30th is that deadline with the accelerated end of the tax credit and how that's happening. I guess I want to frame this as you've obviously been a foundational part of Veloz. You've been in the EV world for a while. You've seen it grow so much. What is it that motivates you right now to keep the fight going and to keep spreading the cost benefits, the very tangible, not just environmental benefits that people realize from EVs when right now things can seem so difficult, particularly in the federal environment?
Yeah, I think what motivates me is that I think there's a reason to drive electric regardless of what walk of life you come from. So whether you're from a red state or a blue state or a purple state, there is a reason to go electric, whether it's you want to save money on your monthly budget, whether you want to clean up the air with no tailpipe emissions, whether you want to be a country where we're leading on high tech. And let's just go back to the consumer side of things. Beyond saving money in your pocketbook, they're just fun to drive, right? They're
Yeah.
fast, they're fun, they're tech forward, and they're not really the future. They're here now, right? So there's a huge opportunity to kick the tires, go take a ride and drive, and figure out which EV makes sense for you. When we started this whole movement, we were only able to give people a few choices. But today, there are dozens and dozens of EVs, and charging is only getting easier. And it's not a matter of is the future electric? It's a matter of how fast can we get to that all electric future?
Yeah. And in terms of spreading that message to folks who are on maybe the periphery of EV ownership, or who know a neighbor or a family member with an EV, or maybe they don't, but they're familiar with EVs, they might have interest in the better driving experience or the cost savings of one. You guys launched this Electric for All campaign this summer, right? With some star power. You get Nick Offerman, his lending his wonderful narration in there. What was the impetus behind first just driving such a big campaign like that? What have been some of the early feedback and results you've seen from that, given also, right, that we are in tumultuous times and there's things like the tax credit that are actionable items for people who may want an EV, right now?
Yeah. So what we know is that Americans want and like electric vehicles, but there is this national hesitancy around electric vehicles because there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation. So it is really critical that Veloz and other like-minded organizations really lean in on educating folks around the many benefits of electric vehicles, how they can save money, how far they go. Most electric vehicles go well over 300 miles on one charge. What are the nuances around charging? How easy it is to charge at home? The rationale for us launching a national Electric for All campaign, which we call The Way Forward is Electric, is just a natural next evolution in a series of campaigns that Veloz has done. So if you go back to 2017, 2018, that's when Veloz launched our first campaign. We were focused on the California market. We did 4 successful EV education campaigns in the state. And it was always the plan to take the campaign and the successes and learnings from the California campaigns and go national. So yes, the timing is great because what's needed more now than ever is to really help answer questions that people have around their hesitancies and help bust myths around the different disinformation that they're hearing in many different ways. One of the things that we've done in addition to the campaign, which is a channel approach in terms of paid media, earned media, owned media, is we have launched electricforall.org. So if you go onto electricforall.org, it's a free resource. You can put in your zip code and you can understand what are all the makes and models of EVs available. And you can learn what are the federal, state, and local incentives for your specific zip code. So yes, while it is important for people to take advantage of the federal tax credit, it goes away at the end of September, there will be state and local incentives that continue beyond September 30th. And we're going to find out what happens after the federal tax credit goes away, right? There's a real possibility that states may stand up additional incentive programs. There's a possibility that automakers may kick in and help further incentivize the movement because we're not going back. We are going forward with EVs, and that is very clear. It's a matter of how fast can we move that adoption curve.
Yeah, no, I think it's significant, I think, to mention that, right? Like the forward progress is baked in at this point. When you look at major automakers, Kia, Hyundai Motor Group, even Toyota, the Germans, the Americans, GM and Ford, you have pretty major investment into their EV programs. And so even if they slow down some of those investments, they're not actually backtracking. They're not shutting down existing factories. And you're talking about serious multi-year investments going on into making products that, as you said, aren't the future, are already here and are pretty good for lots of people, much, much better, much lower cost. We're going to see longer ranges, faster charging, all of the things that have been concerns for people are I've been surprised just how rapidly they're getting better. And I like how you emphasize these for all is not just showing the federal tax credit, you're going to the state and local level, because that's not heralded as much in the media. It's harder to report on, and we have less local media now than we used to. But I'll just give an example where I live in Colorado. There's a pretty decent $3,500 currently incentive for purchasing a new EV or leasing. And that is funded in part by things like a retail delivery tax. There's actually lots of pretty cool, innovative ways that states can fund their own alternatives. And I think we're going to see more of that. And that's really exciting. In addition, I've heard utility companies have an interest in electrification, and they are also fronting some pretty interesting incentive programs to get people to realize savings on their power bill, or at the very least, substantial savings compared to what they'd have from a gas vehicle through having an EV.
Yeah, the data says once people drive electric, whether they buy a new electric vehicle, lease an electric vehicle, or take advantage of the used federal tax credit and get into a used EV, they don't go back. And then what they go do is tell all their neighbors and friends, and then those folks get excited about electric vehicles. It's a really exciting space. Riding in an EV is believing in EVs. And your point is well taken in terms of incentives. There are all the incentives that you mentioned. By the way, big hat tip to Colorado for the additional incentive that they're providing. It's a pretty meaningful amount of money, and we're seeing a lot of sales progress in the state. So hat tip to you all for leading the way on that. But there are a whole wide variety of non-monetary incentives that still exist depending on where you are in the country. For example, there is access to HOV lanes, there's free parking, there's tips and perks here and there. And it's really important to remember that there are incentives beyond September 30th.
Yeah, and is one of the things we've referenced this too is that it's not just that initial benefit of the upfront incentives, which can be significant, or even the like collateral HOV lane access or special
Right.
parking, which EVs get. There are substantial long-term cost of ownership considerations, especially given that the more people drive, right, the less they're spending to charge, but also you consider no oil changes, no transmission fluid, things like that. Is that a benefit that you think is like hard to communicate, or is that something you guys are actively working on and like showing, oh, for this model, this includes how much less you might be likely to spend over 5 years if owning it?
The best way to save on gas is to not buy gas, right?
Yeah.
And our celebrity talent, Nick Offerman, Rick Swanson from Parks and Rec, I think does a really good job articulating that message. As you noted earlier, yeah, you can save up to $2,000 a year on driving an EV. But when you look at the longer term savings, EVs have just fewer parts and there's less maintenance. There's no oil changes. There's no smog checks if you're in California. And the list goes on and on. Yes, for example, I drive an EV. I have a 2018. It has had zero maintenance. The only thing I've done for my electric vehicle is I charge it every night and I change the tires.
Yeah.
There is long-term savings when you have an EV. To your point about communicating that message, for those that are the experts in the field, we often talk about total cost of ownership. And when you're trying to talk to a general market population, you have to break that down into what that means. So that's why you will see in our national campaign, we are talking about that in different ways. We are talking about the short-term savings, take advantage of tax credits now, long-term savings, fewer parts, less maintenance. But we are also encouraging people to go on to electricforall.org, because if they want to dig down into the details, we have all kinds of cost calculators and savings calculators where folks can learn about how they can save even more money. Now, the one thing we haven't talked about is savings through your utility, right? So in an electric vehicle, EVs use a new fuel source. They use electricity.
Mhm.
And ideally, over time, the electric utilities are cleaning up how they're generating that electricity. So, the good news about electric vehicles, if you live in maybe Colorado or a state like California where I live, is that the utilities have a mandate to get to zero emission generation of energy. So, my electric vehicle gets cleaner every year, and I've had it since 2018 because not only does it not have any tailpipe emissions, but the electricity being produced to fuel it is being cleaned up and being generated from renewable sources. The other thing about utilities is that in many cases, they offer special utility rates if you have an EV.
Mhm.
So, one of the biggest benefits of driving an electric vehicle, if you have the ability to charge at home, is to charge at home overnight while you're sleeping. So, you wake up every morning, you've got a full battery. And you can look at electricforall.org and look at your utility and identify whether you can get on a special EV rate, which is cheaper than maybe buying electricity in other locations. So there's the electric rate discount that many utilities offer as well. And folks don't know that until they start doing more research.
Yeah, no, that's a great point to emphasize. And the fact that utilities have such an influential role in this, they are incentivized to get more people to switch to EVs because it makes sense for them, right? It's suddenly a new load source. But it's EVs. I've been shocked just looking at research at like EVs can be a really good tool for a state like Colorado that produces a lot of wind energy at night, has found a lot of use from people plugging in their EVs overnight and not having to curtail as much wind energy. And even to your point about like states that have dirtier grids, which is still the case in a lot of the US, there's lots of data out there that is pretty positive on the fact that even on a very dirty majority coal grid, an EV is still more environmentally friendly than a gas car by virtue of its just inherent efficiency compared to a
That's
combustion
right.
engine. And that's a nuanced technical engineer nerdy point, but I do feel like it's important to know because I think a lot of people, left or right, wherever they may be, may have legitimate concerns about, oh, the battery or all the metals in my EV or the power grid, right? I've heard lots of my well meaning, smart friends mention points like this. And I feel like it's important to nuance and talk about that and how much just sheer independent data there is showing that, like, even in these worst case scenarios, EVs with moderate driving offset that. As you said, the grid only gets cleaner over time. So I feel like that's a very important thing to point out is that the environmental benefits accrue, but they're also like already here and present no matter where you live right now.
Yeah, we could nerd out around the benefits of electric utilities producing clean electricity to power EVs. One of the things that happens as more EVs get on the grid is there's an opportunity to perhaps optimize and distribute the generation and distribution center in terms of cost. So there is a world where electric rates may go down for everyone as the number of EVs go up and more EVs are plugging into the grid. So there's that opportunity as well. And then there's all sorts of interesting, innovative things around demand and how you can send price signals to EV drivers to charge when, like you said, there's lots of wind or lots of solar and you give them a discount. So there's a lot of exciting innovation happening in the utility space that will benefit EV drivers. The
Yeah.
other thing to remember is that our desire is that everyone is healthy, right? And so we all often breathe the same air. It's all blowing around between all of our neighborhoods. And if you get an EV, I get an EV, our neighbors get an EV, it's helping clean up the air, not just for us, but for the folks around us. So one of the things we care a lot about at Veloz is really becoming truer and truer to that electric for all goal because we have to ensure that everyone stands to benefit. So it's really important that we have not just mass market targeting of our campaigns, but we also in California, for example, target California defined disadvantaged and low income communities with incentives that are uniquely available for them, makes and models that are available. And so that's a really, I think, important consideration as we work collectively as a nation to make one of the biggest transitions maybe since the Industrial Revolution, which is
Yeah.
we're not just transforming the transportation sector, but when we transform the transportation sector, we are also transforming the energy sector. So it is a much bigger movement than I think most people realize.
Yeah. But it's important to emphasize, right? It's an achievable thing. Like at one point in time, air conditioning was inconceivable to add to the electric grid. or electrification in general, was a huge project, both federal and state-wise, in terms of its implementation. And to your point, like equity is important, disadvantaged communities, that also includes rural communities. I'll just shout out one of my friends on the Grid Connections podcast. He just had on some folks talking about rural Oregon in EVs. And I see all kinds of data also showing states with lower population density in some areas like Texas see substantial benefits from the utility side, from the consumer side with electrification. And that's even within a state like Texas, which I love Texas, does not have the policy incentives and frameworks that California or Colorado or Washington have. So you're seeing this nationally. The EVs on their own merits are getting all of these benefits. You're seeing the interesting use cases for smart load management on the grid. I think there's so much interesting entrepreneurship going on. That's one of the things that's been giving me a lot of enthusiasm as an EV nerd here. But the other thing is, you touched on this, like the inclusiveness of EVs, right? Part of it is that like just a new vehicle overall is a hard prospect for lots of people in the US, given the average price of a vehicle, gas or electric, is approaching $50,000 now, or maybe it's over that, depending on where you look. And yet, like the thing that maybe is bad for you or me, right? We're early adopters, is that EVs from 2018 and newer have depreciated so much, which does give an interesting insight into the used market, because I have so many friends who are looking for cars who I have told, hey, if you are commuting, used EV is going to save you a ton of money. And I've been shocked at seeing sub $20,000 used EVs and just how much car people are getting for that money.
Yeah, I think we know clearly that a much smaller percentage of the car buying public is buying new vehicles, and most people buy used vehicles. As folks buy new vehicles and retire them at near end of life, or they decide to upgrade or whatever they're doing, that's placing more inventory in the used market, which I think is really important around helping on the affordability front. What's interesting is that, and by the way, the federal tax credit, there is also a used EV tax credit that's going away at the end of September. So it's really important for folks to know that and take advantage of it. The other thing, we talked a little bit about the environmental benefits of EVs, and what we often get asked in terms of the emissions piece and the environmental piece is just around batteries. And we're seeing a lot of the early EVs beginning to reach end of life and come off the road. And it's really exciting to see what is happening in the battery recycling world. And we know many automakers have begun to design their new EVs for the ability to recycle. And there are many automakers that are looking at this. BMW, I think you see in the news, is being a leading global automaker that is really leaning into recycling their batteries, either for a second life or a different way to use the battery. Or in some cases, they're able to recycle the battery for reuse at the automotive grade level. So it's really interesting and innovative work, and I think something to watch for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I've seen so much interesting anecdotes of people talking about energy storage, companies like Redwood Materials out of Nevada, not even just recycling EV batteries, which is a step you can take and it's valuable, but it's a little more expensive, but even repurposing an EV battery that may not be suitable for an on-the-road vehicle anymore, but is more than suitable for being part of a larger microgrid to power a data center or to power a community or something. And that is fascinating.
Yeah, I think what we're finding is a lot of times the knobs and the buttons and the car itself, the body is wearing out before the battery does, right? And so there's an opportunity. The battery is essentially outlasting the life of the car. So there's big opportunity around what next for the battery.
Yeah, I have many people I know who have in the hundreds of thousands of miles, over 200,000 miles on Teslas or earlier EVs, and they do quite well, which is very encouraging to see. I guess as we close, the thing I want to touch on is we're in this moment of continued market development of EVs. Who knows, because of the tax credits ending, we may even see the sales bump of people jumping on those tax credits. But what is the thing you're looking for, whether it be, whether it be a particular model development in EVs or in battery technology? What's the thing you're looking for on the horizon that you think is going to unlock ownership and EV opportunities for people who maybe didn't think an EV was for them in the next 6 months to a year plus?
There's a couple of things. First of all, the first half of 2025 we were already seeing record national sales. And from what I'm seeing in the early data, don't quote me on this, but I think we're going to have a killer July and August and perhaps September as people are really rushing to take advantage of the federal tax credits while they're here. I think in terms of what I'm looking for is what Veloz is always focused on. We focused on helping with three topics. That is helping, encouraging, and tackling the upfront cost challenge. And we're working on that. And I think what's exciting is in 2025, I believe I saw a Bloomberg report that said cost parity, at least between a with a battery and its comparable gas car. We're about to reach cost parity if we haven't already reached that in terms of the largest and most expensive piece, which is the battery component. Really looking forward to seeing prices come down on the upfront cost of electric vehicles. I think number two, really seeing the charging infrastructure not only build out in terms of numbers of fast chargers, but that they're safe, they're reliable, they're accessible. And then as more people use them and there's more throughput, I'm hoping we're going to see the cost of a DC fast charge session come down. And then last, but certainly not least, and we spend a lot of time on this, is education. Because the car companies are certainly, and they are members of Veloz, producing fantastic EVs and fantastic ads. But our space is using our national, third-party, credible, trusted voice to help educate people around the benefits. The challenge is that people don't know the facts, but what we know is when they know the facts, they make really smart decisions and they're very inclined to get into an electric vehicle. So as I look out to the future, I think it's bright, and I'm looking at those three categories in terms of really driving the next wave of EV adopters.
Yeah, no, I can agree on all three of those. And just speaking personally, the charging as someone who has road trip cross country this summer, it's gotten so much better already. And I agree with you. I think like costs can come down, utilization can go up, economics is shifting more and more in EV's favor, and it's so encouraging to see. But thanks so much for your time today, Josh. And These for All, we'll link it in the description. Everyone should check it out, share it with their friends. It's a wonderful campaign you guys are doing at Veloz. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.
And that is a wrap for this episode of Directly Current. Thanks again to Josh from Veloz for his time. Check out Electric for All at our link in the description, as well as the work that we do ourselves at EVs for All America. A lot of inclusiveness going on. We've also got exciting developments happening. I have to remind everyone at the state and the local level, our own Mike Murphy is doing a lot of work, knocking on doors and speaking with the governor of California, for instance, to talk about multi-unit apartment dweller charging, big topic of concern for convenience of people who want an EV but maybe don't have a garage. It matters a lot, and not just in places like California. We're very encouraged, however, at the ongoing existence of incentives in states like California, states like Colorado, Washington, and more that make owning an EV even easier and even cheaper. We think it's important. It's going to keep on. We want the auto industry to prosper in the US, and we think the market is actually quite resilient even with all of this federal bleakness going on. Check out those resources, and do stay tuned to Directly Current. I'm Max Patton. I'll be back later in September, and a Tuesday, 2 weeks from now, with another guest. See you then.